Good evening. I'm Anne McLean from the library's concert office. We are tremendously excited tonight to present the eminent Emerson String Quartet. Phil Setzer, Eugene Drucker, Lawrence Dutton and Paul Watkins. And on the end, a wonderful guest artist, cellist David Finckel, who's the co-director of the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. We are so looking forward to your concert, honoring the memory of a great friend of the Library of Congress, Robert Mann. Welcome to all of you. When you're in Washington, for us it's a bit tricky because you're usually right down the street with our colleagues at the Smithsonian. Isn't this a special anniversary for you there this year, or was it last year?
Gee, I don't know. Well, it was our 40th year, but this is our 42nd year now already, so yeah.
Oh, long. So you're approaching the length of service of Bobby Mann, really. I mean, in terms of you're rolling toward a very, for here at the library, we claim that we have a long relationship with Bobby for 70 years.
Wow.
Which is
Well, we haven't quite gotten there yet,
haven't quite gotten there.
We're getting close.
But exactly how old is the Emerson? I know you started playing in school together, right?
Yeah, but we don't.
Yeah.
We don't count that as part of the official tally of years. But Phil and I began playing together longer ago than I care to admit. But the quartet's professional existence, as Phil said, it's like our 42nd season, or it's been 42 years since we had that first season.
But that's when we met, when we started working with Robert Mann was in our my second year at Juilliard. Which is 1970.
And Bobby used to
that 1970.
He used to say that being in the Juilliard Quartet for 50 years meant that he often had younger colleagues. So that's what kept him young.
I often have younger colleagues
does that
because I'm the oldest one here.
Are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and now you have a new colleague who's, is he keeping you young?
He helps, he carries my suitcase occasionally. Not really, no.
I think I read an interview just very recently that the Juilliard Quartet itself is in its 72nd season now. Is that?
That could be.
I think
because it started right
that
after
makes
the
sense,
war.
shortly after the war.
I think so. Yeah. And just for the record, to explain how we get to these points, we figure the Juilliard Quartet, and Bobby first brought them to the library December 10th, 1948. So we got to that for the 70 years, basically, close to that. So we have, of course, a long and remarkable history. And one of the things that we want to talk with you about is how his influence shaped you as a quartet and your teaching individually. And also we want to, a little later, make the points that the library really is an institution which saw Bobby inhabit many of the roles that he had in his career. Not only a great performer, but a composer. His works were performed here. He lectured here. He taught master classes here, and so forth. So it's really a remarkable perspective that we have. In terms of what we wanted to start with, though, we'd love to hear a little bit more about your projects, all of you, and that includes David, because you have so many exciting things. And one of the things that Bobby brought was a sense of adventure, for us anyway. And so I know, and I think the audience probably knows, something about your performances of The Black Monk, and also some other really interesting new projects. So maybe you would talk about that a little bit.
Well, the Shostakovich and The Black Monk, I don't know if any of you got to see that at Wolf Trap. Yeah, a couple of hands went up. Is sort of the latest project that we've actually performed. There's another project coming up on the horizon, which somebody can talk about. There were a couple of theater and music collaborations that we've done. One was called The Noise of Time with Simon McBurney, also about Shostakovich, but a very different approach to it. This one has more to do with his interest, or I would say almost obsession with a Chekhov story called The Black Monk that Shostakovich wanted to make into an opera most of his life, and never got to it, and finally tries at near the end of his life, and is just too frail, too weak to actually write it all out. He plans it, but he just can't quite do it. And I and a number of other people whom I trust feel that some of the music for that opera ended up in especially the last two string quartets. There's this swirling music in the 15th quartet that if that's not the Black Monk, then it's a very strange coincidence. And also this sort of Italian serenade music that occurs in the 14th quartet in the slow movement. It comes back at the end. I think is a reference to the Braga serenade that Chekhov talks about in the story. And we know that Shostakovich was going to include that in the opera because he made an arrangement of it. So we sort of, in a way, kind of tried to finish the opera without making an opera out of it. There's 7 actors, and the brilliant director and writer James Glossman, interweaved the Chekhov story with Shostakovich's story, and then I worked on the music side of it and sort of interweaved the music of Shostakovich and Braga through the drama. And the other just personal thing for me is it's the first time, my wife is Linda Setzer, and she's an actress, and it's the first time that we were able to collaborate on something of that magnitude. So she plays Irina Shostakovich in it. So.
Wow, amazing. And I was interested about the 7 actors, and I wondered if any of you are daring to think of acting yourselves in any future, or narrating or something.
No.
No.
I've been too close to it and seen how hard it is. I would never. It's like people ask me, don't you want to play jazz? And I say, yeah, I have dreams about sitting at the piano and being able to play jazz, but you don't. There's something smart about knowing what you shouldn't try to do.
And David, you have a Russian project, a major Russian project going on at the Chamber Music Society this year too, don't you?
Yeah, well, we're faced with full, 9-month seasons of concerts, winter seasons, and of late we've come to try to put a kind of a thematic stamp on each season, and for some reason this year the music of Russia emerged. So we just had a concert the other night to open the season, which was a bunch of composers and musicians who influenced early Russian music. Actually, there was only one Russian on the whole program, but there's people like Schumann and Mendelssohn and John Field and even Viotti, who went to Russia, so that was fun. But in the Winter Festival coming up, which is in March, there'll be 4 concerts devoted to the full spectrum of Russian music, which includes the very early stuff, the hyper-romantic nationalist stuff of the age of the empire, and then, of course, the very, very edgy and significant 20th century repertoire that's very much a reflection of the times in which the composers lived.
So wonderful. And don't you take patrons on your tours too, as well? I mean, that's a huge thing.
Taking them to the Gulag for this trip.
Oh my goodness.
No, but we did actually. We did a St. Petersburg trip,
That's
not
what I
in
remember, yeah.
relation to the New York festival, in relation to one of our California festivals. But that was fun. And yes, we just got back from a tour that related once again to another festival, and so yes, patron tours are quite fun.
I understand from watching intensively various YouTube things about these people that, of course, each of them has a private passion, and one of David's apparently is food. So we could come back to that. But before
Anytime, man, anytime.
Before we get to that, I wanted to say that this afternoon we looked at some sketches in Alban Berg's hand. David, you weren't here for that, but we quickly looked at a few for the lyric suite. This was part of the Rudolf Kolisch collection, the Kolisch String Quartet, for just to see the analysis in Berg's hand, and it was kind of fascinating, even a quick look. But this relates to one of your very most recent projects, and if you could talk a little, one of you said that being a musician is like being a detective, I think, in some ways.
a few years ago, we recorded Barracks' lyric suite, and there's the sixth movement of that suite had a hidden voice part. The whole piece was secretly about Berg's adulterous love affair with a woman named Hannah Fuchs. Each of them was married to somebody else while this was going on, and I don't think the affair lasted all that long, and certainly for Berg it did not end happily. I think he was heartbroken that they couldn't pursue their relationship. He made a gift to Hannah Fuchs of a secretly annotated score when it was first published, full of color-coded references to secrets that are embedded in the score, musical symbolism that has to do with specific events in their relationship. Her two children are represented as characters in the second movement.
Their initials?
His initials and Hannah Fuchs's initials are interwoven into the musical motifs. But the most significant difference is that the sixth movement had a secret text. It was a German translation by Stefan George of a poem by Baudelaire from Les Fleurs du Mal, and it's called De Profundis Clamavi. I can't recall now whether the French version has that Latin title, but it is a poem that expresses utter desolation. This was a part of an anthology that they apparently liked to read together, and he knew that it would have a great deal of meaning for her. So the way it's a hidden voice part is that it was never meant to be performed with the voice and with the text in any way that would be apparent to the public. And it was only decades later, about 40 years after Berg's death, when his widow, Helene, died, then George Pearl, the eminent composer and musicologist, came out with an annotated score full of the results of the detective work that he had done, some of which involved Hannah Fuchs's daughter, who was a very young child at the time that her mother had this connection with Berg. But she was the keeper of this annotated score, and she seemed to know what a lot of it was about. So in that sixth movement, Berg indicated exactly the words and the notes that each of the instruments is playing in turn, which were doubling this hypothetical voice part. So George Pearl reconstructed that voice part with the full text, and it's quite powerful. So a few years ago, we recorded the lyric suite with two versions of that sixth movement. The first version without voice, the way Berg intended for it to be heard, and then the other version as he intended for Hannah Fuchs to imagine it, and as he himself imagined it, and with the marvelous soprano Renee Fleming as our collaborator in this work. And the CD also featured some works by other composers from that same period or the same sort of stylistic bent. Egon Welles, who set 5 sonnets by Elizabeth Barrett Browning that were translated into German by Rilke, and Schoenberg's youngest student, Eric Zeisel, who came to the United States. I think he did a little work for the film industry, but he never really made it. He died at a relatively early age, tragically, of a heart attack. And there's this, he wrote tons of songs, but there was just one song that we included in this. But speaking of Renee Fleming, and since you're asking about future projects, I think Phil was alluding to the fact that we have another project with Renee Fleming coming up. It'll be premiered in Tanglewood next July. It's work by Andre Previn with a text by Tom Stoppard. And it is based on the myth of the Odyssey, and Renee will play the character of Penelope in this. It's sort of a monologue for soprano, piano, and string quartet.
It's
And it's all
wonderful.
the events based on the Odyssey and Penelope's extremely long wait for Odysseus to return from his adventures.
These are remarkable and thoughtful, creative projects that are fascinating to hear about. And I know that Bobby would have been very keen on hearing about all of them. And I was thinking about a comment that he made that I wanted to move toward the idea of what you learned from him about, he said that he loved he said that to me one day that he loved rehearsing with Claudio Arrau because Arrau was somebody who, he said he was a person who was willing to enter into an exploration of the way to do something, which is a wonderful way to rehearse. And I was wondering if that joy of exploration and adventure is something you experienced with him.
Do you remember?
Oh, I do. I mean, actually, we all came, well, David did not study with Robert Mann, obviously. Paul didn't either. So it was really just the three of us. You guys had worked with him in the early formation of the quartet, right? That
Right.
was with Masao, or no, not with Guillermo and Eric.
Yeah.
And I also worked with him later, actually, than they did, and he was very fond of me. I had a wonderful relationship. I'm good friends with his son, Nicky. He was a force of nature, and if you sat down and played chamber music with him, if he sat down and read a string quartet with him, I mean, there were no. He could take you on that journey of that music. He could lead you in such a way that it was extraordinary, actually. It was just absolutely an extraordinary experience to play with him. It really was, yeah.
You know, for us, we think about the personal side of him as well as the musical side, and so many of us who worked here knew Bobby for a very long time, obviously. And there were times when he first came to the library, the managers, the chiefs of the division then asked that they play sometimes up to 15 or 20 concerts a year, which we can't imagine today for a residency. It's just unsupportable in terms of the time frame that an artist, a group like yours would have to devote. But that's one of the things that they said to him when he first took this on was, would you be willing to come to Washington and live here 3 to 4 days a week? And that, didn't quite work. But one of the other things that I was thinking about was the sense of humor. He had an amazing sense of humor. And he was also he was incredibly focused. When you spoke to him about your interest or when he was telling you something, you were the person in his line of vision, and no one else was around. I don't know if you felt that too occasionally.
I mean, he was very intense human being, and when we worked with him, I mean, he was at the same time supportive to us, but extremely critical, and it was. I was used to that from having worked with Raphael Druyan in Cleveland for my, I studied with him from the age of 9 till I came to Juilliard. So, and he was a very, very demanding teacher. Really expected a lot out of me, Druyan. And at the same time, I always felt sure of where I was with Druyan and also with Mann, and I knew that if they liked something that I did, that it really had to be very good, and it wasn't so much a shock to me. I think he really loved the Emerson Quartet, or whatever we were called, the baby Emerson Quartet, and thought that we had a chance if we stayed together. He was encouraging us to stay together and really make a go of it. I think also there were times where he would get exasperated because we just couldn't do what he wanted us to do. But
Also, I mean, he had his opinion about the way a string quartet.
Well, I was just going to say, he said
Yeah.
he did not think that the switching, in which we're only doing a
really?
little bit of
What-
switching tonight,
what
but
you're
usually
known
we
for.
play half the concert, one of us playing first violin, the other.
He didn't
And
like
he
that.
said in the beginning, this is not going to work. We tried it in our quartet, it didn't work.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's not going to work in your quartet. And
But to his credit.
But
later,
yeah, to his credit,
it publicly in a New York Times article, he said I was wrong. It
he's,
really,
yeah,
you know,
and he,
it was very, it was wonderful.
he did,
Interesting.
he did apologize for that, which was an amazing moment, actually, for him to say I was, I was wrong.
Well, it's partly because we had stayed together, and to him, in those very early years, he thought it was a sign of lack of commitment on our part.
Yeah.
That neither one of us could submerge his own ego enough to
Right.
consent to play second violin
Right,
all the
but
time.
I think that after a while, he understood that it had evolved naturally for us that way, because we had always done that. And for
Yeah.
us to have made a decision to change that after having done it for a few years as students and entering as a professional quartet, it was already 6 or 7 years that we were doing it. It was very natural for us to keep doing that. And I think if we had made a decision to do it the other way, I mean, who knows? It wouldn't have felt organic somehow.
Well, he was always interested in the new, too, and I was thinking we should talk about the compositions that we heard of his and so on, but before that I was thinking that you, too, as you've just said, with these new projects, you're doing new things all the time, and you play new works by Sariaho and Reem and others and so on, and I noticed that you have a newish record with British music, and I was wondering if that's Paul's influence, the chacons and fantasias, and no, it's a beautiful record, but
I don't think it's got anything to do with me,
Except that you played it.
except that I'm playing on it. I think it's fair to say that Phil, who has quite a lot to do with the programming of our repertoire, I think he might have had that in the works anyway.
That was planned with David. I mean, that was something that we were talking about
And
doing.
certainly the Britain second and third quartets. You'd played as a group together. The Purcell Fantasias were maybe a bit more of a, well, not really a departure for the Emerson Quartet, because of course one of my favorite Emerson recordings is of Bach's The Art of Fugue. So playing that really music before the advent of the string quartet as we know it. It's something, with Purcell we're going back even another, Gene, 50 years, more than that actually, for the Bach. It's earlier still, so that was perhaps a bit of a departure.
Yeah, because Bach wrote the Art of the Fugue in the 1740s, in the last decade of his life. And Purcell died in, 1696?
95.
1695, yeah.
Well, one thing also, David, you should talk for a second. The connection to Britain came, or the admiration for Britain, I think, came partly through Rostropovich, right? I mean, that's how I first came to it, was because of your knowledge of it through Slava.
That's possible. As a young cellist, I was very enamored of the cello music of Benjamin Britten. He wrote 5 fantastic pieces for cello, 3 solo suites, the cello and piano sonata, and the great symphony concerto, by the way, which Paul recorded fantastically, if you ever get a chance to hear that. So, yes, perhaps I brought my enthusiasm for Britten into the Emerson Quartet, and the first piece we did of his was the second quartet. And I'm so happy that they finally got around to recording that and the third as well. Now you have to do the first.
Yep. Yeah, we got to learn that one. But, one thing you should just mention, because it hasn't been mentioned yet, but most of you know that David was our cellist for 34 years. It was the same 4 people for that length of time, from 79 till David decided to leave a few years ago. And I remember we talked to David and said, well, God, who, you know us better than anybody, you know our playing better than anybody, you know us as people. Who do you think, is there anybody that could replace you? Who do you think would be the best person? He thought about it for a second. He said, well, my number 1 choice would be Paul Watkins, but you'll never get him. And that was partly because Paul was living in London and had 2 young children, and we didn't realize we'd be able to get him to do this. But it is funny that those were the words that came out of David's mouth.
And it's such an extraordinary thing to have all five of you to play this work, because I was present when you had that so memorable moment of handing off, and that was
That's right.
just such a,
That was down here, that was at Smithsonian, yeah,
yeah,
down the street.
here at the Smithsonian,
But
and
w- yeah,
it was just incredibly memorable for me. And when I was thinking about when Bobby passed away, I was thinking, well, what kind of a concert would we want to be able to do? And this came into my mind, and
Yeah.
I said, well, I'll never be able to get them. That's what.
well,
Thank you.
another ghost in the room tonight will be Rostropovich, with whom we played and recorded the Schubert, and that was David's teacher, so.
Well, you know, in a moment, there's so much to talk about in so very little time, because I know they have to get ready and so on, but a couple of other things. We have actually an interesting clip, if we have time for it, of the Budapest playing this work with Gregor Piatigorsky. And what's interesting about it is that, I'll make a copy for you guys. What's interesting about it is that Piatigorsky didn't take the second cello. They gave him the other role, which is kind of fun and interesting.
Maybe he didn't know how to do pizzicato
Yeah,
or something.
something like that.
I think that's part
But
Similarly, when Pablo Casals recorded the Schubert Quintet with the Vey Quartet, right? He played first cello, and what I remember about the LP cover was that there was a minuscule picture of the Vey Quartet, a very large picture of Pablo Casals, and a sort of medium-sized picture of Schubert.
Yeah, that sort of says it all right there.
so, speaking of these great players, as I said, we have all these wonderful recordings made here, and one of the things that I wanted to say too is that Bobby spent a lot of time in the studio listening to these, and we made a wonderful radio series about, and some of you probably heard some of those. But there's also a clip that I'd like to play for you that gives you the idea of how Bobby Mann came to the library, what it is about, his life that led him to the library. And this came from those sessions in the studio with me many years ago, if you have that mic ready to play.
As a teenager, my greatest pleasure was getting together with my friends and reading chamber music. Actually, I enjoyed it more than studying all the concertos and all the exercises and developing my violin playing. But I can tell you that maybe the most remarkable kind of experience that I had was listening on the radio to live performances of the Budapest String Quartet from the Library of Congress. Now, a young boy growing up in Oregon, what's he know about the sophisticated world of chamber music? But I used to think and dream, that is the life for me. And I used to think, if I could do anything like these wonderful members of the Budapest Quartet are doing, that would be a great satisfaction and reward and a way of life.
So this is, something that is very personal, to hear him talk about that. As a child, he thought about the library, and he said when he got the call in 1962 from Harold Spivak, that was our former boss, he said, "Bobby, are you standing or are you sitting? I have some news for you. How would you like to be the resident quartet at the Library of Congress?" He said that was a dream come true. So for 50 years, he was here during that period, beginning in 1948.
I was going to, I was just thinking about his influence on us. I would say that the model of the Juilliard Quartet is really the model that we would probably align ourselves with. It's the model of really trying to play all the repertoire, everything from Purcell to contemporary music, and being able to try to do it as well as you can, being able to do all the styles and commission new music and stuff. And that was a great model for us, the Juilliard. I mean, how they did that. I mean, and they commissioned they had so many works written for them. And then, of course, they could play Haydn and they could play Beethoven, and that's really, to be a quartet, you need to be able to do all of it.
And I was looking at this quote by Alan Kozin saying that he thought that Robert Mann represented not only, of course, the continuity within the Juilliard Quartet and the quartet world, but to a great degree, quote, the development of chamber music in the United States during the second half of the 20th century. And this is something that resonated with me. And now you, all of you, are teaching, you have very important jobs in the music world, and this kind of influence does not die.
Yeah, I would go further to say that he and the Juilliard Quartet that he formed had an international reach, and certainly the growing up as a kid in South Wales in the 1970s, and then going to a music school outside London in the 1980s. I was well aware of the the distinguished series of concerts here at the Library of Congress. That was something that was disseminated across BBC Radio 3 as well. And when I turned up at the Menuhin School at the age of 13, I remember being absolutely delighted about many things, but delighted that they had a whole room with about the size of this room, actually, with the length of that wall devoted to records, enormous amounts of records, and many recordings of the Juilliard Quartet were there, and particularly their groundbreaking recordings of the Bartok quartets were there. So in the 80s, I devoured those and wore them out, and then little did I know that while I was listening to these things and desperately learning to play the cello and learning to play chamber music, another quartet on the other side of the Atlantic were getting ready to make an equally groundbreaking recording of the 6 Bartok quartets. It now happens to be a quartet that I'm a member of. And, it's amazing how life works like that, really. But,
and Bartok was a huge element in his life from a young man, and that's something everyone knows that the Juilliard Quartet made its name with Bartok early on, and that Kusevitsky invited them to Tanglewood in part because he knew their Bartok already, and of course he knew who they were, but he was interested in the fact that they were so adventurous. And people talk about David Harrington from the Kronos Quartet talks about the blazing, propulsive quality of Bobby Mann's playing on those early records with Robert Koff, Arthur Winograd, and Raphael Hillier. But I didn't know until I started looking into this that he had recorded as a very younger man the Bartok sonatas with Leonid Hambro. He made his debut conducting the Bartok piano concerto. I didn't know that. So Bartok was a huge element in his life. And did you ever study Bartok with him?
Yes, the first quartet that Phil and I ever learned as members of an embryonic, and I'm talking about a long gestation period, Emerson Quartet, was the second Bartok Quartet. Now, that's not necessarily the way that we would advise young quartets to begin learning how to play together, but it seemed to work okay for us. It took us most of the academic year to get that piece under our belts, and it's still one of my favorite pieces.
It's good that if we'd started with something like Haydn, we probably wouldn't still be together.
We might play this clip for just a moment. It's a funny thing to reach back and find these things, and it may not be the best playing, but we've got 2 incredible cellists here, and I'd just be curious to see their reaction. This is a Schubert quintet performance, and maybe we could talk about the quintet a little bit in terms of the remarkable pairings of voices and all the things that go back and forth. Do you have that one, Mike? We'll hear just a little bit of that. Might take a moment to cue it. was just a moment from the past there, but so how do you manage such a work? Is it as enjoyable to do as to hear?
This is where you come out with the answer. In a way, it's impossible to talk about something like the Schubert Cello Quintet because it's. I mean, what can you say? What can you say? What can I say that will do it justice? I can't. I'll try to do it some sort of justice tonight when I play it. But I mean, it's my favorite piece. I don't know. I wouldn't know how to say it. And you think about what he did, what Schubert did in the last year of his life, knowing that he was dying, and the amount of music, even just the amount of music that's in this one piece that he left for us, frantically writing these huge pieces to leave something on this earth, and yeah.
You know, one of the things that we would like to do here is to do a concert from the year 1827 to 1828, just that year. There's just, or a whole series about them, as you say, that
Yeah,
period.
we did once in New York. We did the late Beethoven quartets with the late Schubert, and all written within a few years in Vienna.
You were asking who that was.
Who was playing?
So that was the Budapest Quartet playing at the very end of its tenure here with Gregor Piatigorsky.
Yeah.
So just for a moment, but I mean, it's an ancient recording and so on, but it just has something that.
Were they playing on those instruments? We were just wondering.
Piatigorsky was playing, or one of them actually, I don't know which of the two, was playing the Strad, our Strad cello. So that's what accounts for that very deep sound. Let's backtrack just for a moment onto the Elliott Carter before we lose time. And that is something, do you have any comments you'd like to make on the Carter, since that's such a work that Bobby Mann was identified with, of course, tremendously? Did you ever talk to him about the Carter quartets or work on them?
I actually sat behind Elliott Carter in a couple of rehearsals of the third quartet before they premiered it, which is the most difficult one of the five. It's basically two pieces for duos, two duos that doesn't really, that they kind of go on at the same time, but they don't intersect much. It's incredibly difficult to do, even with a click track, and the Juilliard Quartet didn't do it that way. They did it by leading some big beats of places where they would come together, but it was even for them, it was a tremendous challenge. I remember Bobby Mann looking just absolutely exhausted, walking around the halls where they were rehearsing like 10 hours a day trying to get this thing. And I remember sitting behind Carter, and we had this huge score, and I was trying to, I couldn't really make sense out of just looking at it, but they were making sense out of it on the stage, and I heard the premiere of it. But years later, this is kind of a funny story. I went to, we were invited to a reception at Carnegie Hall in which Ara Guzulimian was given the French Legion of Honor for getting out on the stage of Carnegie Hall several times and talking about how this is after the Persian Gulf War, and people were demonstrating against French music. And Ara made a number of speeches as he was, at Carnegie Hall then. He's now the head of Juilliard School, saying that art will be here long after we're not here, and we can't treat it this way. And because he did that, he was given this French Legion of Honor by Pierre Boulez. And everybody was in this small room, including Elliott Carter, and Carter's wife had just passed away. And I saw him sitting in a wheelchair by himself, and I didn't think he would know or remember me at all, even though I had met him, a few times over the years. But I saw him sitting there by himself, and I went over to him, and he was very hard of hearing, and he lived to be over 100. And I knew that I had to talk loud to him, and I said, "Mr. Carter," and I said, "I'm Philip Setzer from the Emerson String Quartet, and I just wanted to tell you I was very sorry to hear about your wife." And he said, and he goes in this really loud voice, so loud that everybody in the room, the New York Times, you know, the French government, Pierre Boulez, everybody stops and turns around. He goes, Emerson Quartet, in this really loud voice. Everybody stops. He says, great quartet. Why the hell don't you play my string quartet?
Oh, wow. Did you have an answer for him?
I said, well, we've been thinking of doing the first quartet. I like the first quartet a lot. He says, difficult piece. It's going to take a lot of rehearsal. I said, luckily, I didn't say anything about the Elegy because I'm not even sure whether he liked the Elegy. It's an early work. We think very beautiful work, and we wanted to do something of Carter's in memory of Bobby, and this is the only one that we know. So, but
Doesn't sound like Elliott Carter from the later works. Sounds much more like Aaron Copland.
yeah, it was written in 1946 originally as a viola piece, apparently viola and piano, and then arranged for orchestra, and then he made a quartet arrangement of it. But it's beautiful.
So I think if you have time for just maybe 2 or 3 questions, I sort of, I could go on like this for a long time because I'm fascinated in talking with these people who are at the very pinnacle of the music world, and they occupy really a position of enormous responsibility. One final thing I guess I was going to ask you about was, I was looking at comments from Sasha Snyder and Boris Kreut. Sasha made the comment that he felt that he wanted to just go out and play the music, that he felt that after 30 years that he didn't have to worry about the projecting each note, that he was going to be able to be part of the music that way. And Boris Kreut said, interestingly, that after many years with Budapest, he wanted to feel that he could enjoy the music. He wanted to be just there in the music. So does this, as you approach maybe you're past your 40th anniversary now, and David, you're into a realm of managing many people doing all sorts of extraordinary music making. What is your perspective on this? Do you feel that that's something you've reached, or are you mostly still thinking each note, each moment? Notice how he's moving the microphone.
Well, it never stops. I think you keep searching to learn this music. You'll never finish interpreting it, and there's no end. I mean, that's why there could be so many multiple interpretations, many string quartets, many great performers, because there's always another way to look at this music. And you had the Budapest, and you had the Polish quartet. I mean, totally. And then the next generation, you had the Juilliard, you had the Guarneri quartet. It's an endless search. I think if you give up searching and give up trying to, come up with new ideas. I mean, the funny thing about it is that you go through so many permutations of tempos and everything, and you could see from looking at the part, how many times you've done multiple bowings and stuff that, well, we used to do that up bow, and now we're back, and then we went to down for about 10 years, and now we're back to up bow. There's certain things we can do with the bow, which is actually not too many things, just up or down. And maybe connect a few notes or whatever, but you never stop. I mean, because you get to different places with this music, and it changes. It changes as you age, and when we were playing Beethoven, it's much different now than when we were younger, and it's great. I mean, it is as what Bobby said, but as a kid, yeah, that's right. It's a dream. It is a dream to be able to play this great repertoire.
Maybe that's a good stopping point. You think? Yeah. I think actually we probably do. You need to get backstage and warm up. So I think we'll stop there. And thank you so much for being part of this and taking the time to talk with us. And one comment about our brochure. In that brochure, it says that with musicians like these, there may be some hope for humanity. I think that's really true.